It's really a great pleasure to have you all here again for our second Beyond Cyber event with newfangled microphones and everything, so we'll see how it goes. The purpose of Beyond Cyber, some of you may know, is to really bring together the cybersecurity community in a slightly different way and get them to think beyond some of the things that we are already thinking about in cybersecurity, get people to think differently. So those that don't know, my name's Professor Dan Prince from Lancaster University, Professor of Cybersecurity there, and I'm also the ACE CSE, so the Academic Centre of Excellence in Cybersecurity Education, co-director along with Simon, who's over the back. And really, Lancaster has been pushing forward in cybersecurity for over 2 decades now. And there's been a real resurgence of technical activity around cybersecurity in the Northwest, and so it's great to bring people together in the dish to really start to think differently about cybersecurity. So the format for today, this evening, is we're going to hear from our esteemed guest for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have almost like a reverse panel session. So unfortunately, Gabriella's going to get a little bit grilled from a few of us for about 30 to 20 minutes, and then it'll be over to you. So whilst we're asking questions, it's time for you to be writing down your questions so you have something good to ask. And we will be taking names and judging the quality of your questions later on. So get some good ones. But without any more nonsense from me, I'd like to hand over to Gabriella for her talk.
All right, so hi everyone. Before I start, I really just want to thank Anna and Dan for inviting me and helping me with all the logistics to get here. And I really do believe in this mission of trying to get diversity of thought. I'm an anthropologist, not the usual sort of character when it comes to cyber, but I do believe we're often in these silos, and one of the great ways to kind of get out of them is doing what's happening here. So I'm just gonna dive right in. All right, so today, first I'll introduce myself very briefly. So as I said, I'm an anthropologist. I've been working on the kind of ethics and politics of computer hacking for 20 years. My first project was on free and open source software, looking at the ways in which open source developers came to see source code as a form of First Amendment speech. My second project was crazy on Anonymous. I'm not going to tell you how I got into it, but I spent 6 years studying them, and I'll be talking about their tactic, the hack and leak, today. My current project is looking at former non-malicious black hat hackers who are part of the underground and looking how they professionalized to become cybersecurity leaders. And weirdly enough, this project helped me understand the hack and leak. So let me define the hack and leak to start. So this tactic involves infiltrating private digital systems, extracting sensitive data, advertising the hack. This is really important for my definition, and publicly releasing the data, often through platforms like WikiLeaks or DDoS secrets today. So before I continue, I'm going to ask you all a question. When do you think this tactic came into being? When did hackers start using it? What decade? And if you've read some of my work, don't say.
70s?
The 70s. Okay, great. Other?
80s.
80s? Okay. So I'm going to my argument is that it's an incredibly recent tactic. And that's what fascinates me. And I'm going to tell you the moment I started to think about this tactic and look at its history, because I also thought it came, it existed as long as hackers existed. So one day in my office in 2014, someone from the New York Times calls me. And basically, he's like, Biella, it's my nickname. You know a lot of hackers. I need some documents. How do I let hackers know that I'm working on this topic? Because they might be interested in this topic as well. Mortified, because you can't request a hack and leak, I reminded him that hackers themselves are the ones that engage in this. But my interest was piqued. I was like, a threshold has been reached. Journalists now do use this material. So I started to kind of dig in deep, and I wanted to learn about the genesis of this tactic. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But just to give you a sense of the history, before 2010, at least in the sort of English-speaking world, here are some examples of hacks and leaks as I define them. I'll be talking about 3 and 4 later in the talk. As you can see, not many. There was a lot of hacking and there was a lot of leaking, but not in the way I'm talking about. Now look at this list, which is actually completely incomplete. It has completely exploded. So basically, I mean, just to forecast the general argument, although it's more specific, I mean, anonymous in the era of WikiLeaks is really when this stabilized. There were some instances before, but anonymous got to this tactic quite independently. They were all over the news, and because they were all over in the news, the template was available basically for copycatting. But again, I found this surprising. Hackers hack, right? I really thought that I was going to find much earlier instances of this, because there were all sorts of underground hacker groups, you know, on both sides of the Atlantic, from the 80s, 90s, and even before. These are some of them: the Hacker's Choice, Tezo, ADM, Root, Haggis, and so many more, who are breaking into systems, right? And in fact, right at the period when they were starting to professionalize, which again remembers my current project, there was a project going by the name of anti-sec, anti-security. These were hackers, part of the underground, who didn't want to professionalize. They wanted their secret kingdom. They thought it was fun, right? They didn't want for exploits and vulnerabilities to get patched. So what did they do? What did anti-sec do? Has anyone here heard of anti-sec? Okay, you have. I'll have to talk to you later. So anti-sec basically hacked professionalizing hackers and dumped their emails. But it was just to shame them. I'm going to come back to this later. Now, it was interesting too, because again, I thought that this tactic existed. And as part of this project on professionalizing an anti-sec, I interviewed some of these hackers who had been breaking into systems. And I asked them, well, did you ever think to hack and leak? And one of them said, I wish we had done something about it, but we didn't, because they had access to the emails of very powerful people, he explained. I think we could have exposed a lot of corruption and a lot of wrongdoing of a lot of high-profile political people. Now, you know, the conditions weren't totally ideal back then for hacking and leaking, because you didn't have platforms like WikiLeaks who were recording these leaks. But you did have things like Cryptome, which is a mailing list founded in the mid-90s, which were recording leaks. And to be clear, some of the leaks here maybe the source was a hack, but it was not advertised as a hack. And that's a kind of clear difference I'm trying to kind of get at. Now, to give one more example before I go into the history that I think helps show that it wasn't really part of the political imagination of hacktivists or malicious actors, I drew on an example from the UK. Does anyone know of this event? So in 1984, after accessing Prince Philip's Prestel mailbox, 2 British hackers chose to notify British Telecom playfully rather than misuse their access or leak their emails to the press. They sent a message from the Prince's account to Prestel's manager saying, I do so enjoy puzzles and games. Ta-ta, pip, pip, signed H and RH hacker. This, of course, prefigures sort of like hacking, letting the company know, fix your vulnerability. But they didn't take the emails and leak it to the press, which is what I'm kind of interested in. All right, so let's get to this history of how this came into being. So I'm going to start with a non-digital example, partly because I'm looking for more of the one example of a brick and mortar hack and leak. As we know, most forms of leaking has come traditionally from insiders, people with access to material, like with the Pentagon Papers and Daniel Ellsberg. There's one important exception in the American context. I'm looking for more, so if you have anything to offer, please do. There was a group going by the name Citizens Commission to Expose the FBI, at the time completely anonymous. And in 1971, they broke into an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. They left with stolen documents, which they photocopied and sent to various newspapers. They were never caught. So the leaked documents directly revealed some illegal FBI surveillance and indirectly led to the revelation and shutdown of a program called COINTELPRO, which was a program of disinformation and sabotage leveled against the American activist groups in the 1960s. And it's really interesting how COINTELPRO was found. There was one reference to COINTELPRO in the documents, and a couple years later, an NBC reporter did a FOIA on this program and got the material. All right, so again, if you know of other cases like this, which is like a hack and leak, but a brick and mortar one. Obviously, this is hard to replicate. That they got away with it was extremely hard. So, this didn't become common. So now I'm going to leapfrog to the early 2000s and look at two cases of email leaks that did not come from hacks. But I think they're relevant because they start to show that maybe this material can be used in the public interest, but they also show the sort of like privacy issues that come with leaking this material. So let me start with the first case related to the Diebold voting machine. So the Diebold voting machine source code and documents were acquired by Beth Harris, a citizen concerned with voting machine vulnerabilities with security. She found them on an unencrypted FTP server during an internet search. She sought journalists to sift through the material to investigate potential security flaws. But you know what? They could not really be bothered. She sent out 1,000 press releases and got nothing. Then she contacted computer scientists who started to dig in, and indeed, there were stunning, stunning flaws, as this New York Times reporter noted. 6 months later, in an op-ed, Paul Krugman asked why journalists did not search the leaked Diebold emails, given they held evidence that executives likely knew about the flaws. Because this was really a time where journalists weren't doing that. So the other example is the Enron corpus, which has actually trained a lot of our AI. So that same year, a kind of obscure administrator at an obscure American agency released over 600,000 Enron corporate emails online during the investigation against its executives. So according to the Wall Street Journal, the government officer published the corpus, quote, to help the public better understand whether Enron helped to create and then profit from an energy shortage in California during 2000 and 2001. So while the emails did offer insights into Enron's corrupt culture, most media outlets avoided covering them, citing privacy concerns. Okay, I think one of the reasons that in this era, when emails started to be leaked, that you didn't really see journalists diving into them, is because going through emails is a real big pain in the ass, right? It is a really unwieldy genre. It is thousands and thousands of messages. There weren't like search tools as there are now. And so I think that is one reason. Also, there wasn't as robust of a tech journalistic sphere as there is today. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of leapfrog to the anonymous era. So today, anonymous is often synonymous with hacktivism, but back in the mid-2000s, basically there was no clear sign that anonymous was heading towards any activist or hacktivist territory. Back then, the name was adopted from the default anonymous username given to 4chan posters. 4chan is a discussion board. Before 2008, the name anonymous was entirely associated with internet trolling, raiding, which almost always entailed sort of swarming events that led to doxing, harassment, prank calling, swatting, and these sorts of things. But something happened in 2008 when trolls famously used the moniker Anonymous to target the Church of Scientology. But basically, it morphed into an earnest protest. If you're interested in this, I've written about what happened and how that happened, because it was a very weird and surprising transformation. So this is the first group of sort of activists using the name Anonymous more earnestly. So this happened in 2008. In 2009, you have two bona fide sort of hacks and leaks. One that happened here, actually, and then another one by anti-fascist hackers. So I'll start with the first one, ClimateGate. based on climate research unit hack in a UK university, an unknown party, perhaps connected to Russia, released thousands of emails and documents that allegedly showed scientific collusion. While all the scientists were cleared of wrongdoing, the aim was to clearly sow doubt about climate change and sort of forecast what would happen in the future. So this is the other hack and leak. The other 2009 hack and leak targeted the controversial British historian and Holocaust denier David Irving by breaking into his website. The hacker snatched the emails and information about his speaking engagements and handed them to WikiLeaks, who published them. It triggered modest coverage, as you can see here. Even though it was signed anti-fascist hackers, we now know who it is. It was Jeremy Hammond, who became involved with Anonymous later. He was not involved in Anonymous in 2009. So after jail, I interviewed him. He got arrested during the Anonymous era. So basically, and this is why I brought up Anti-Sec 1, remember? So during the interview, he explained he was partly inspired by Anti-Sec 1, the niche underground movement critical of hacker professionalization. While Hammond found anti-sex politics lacking, it was done for revenge, he admired the direct action approach. He began hacking and selectively sharing racist, fascist emails with Chicago activist networks. Eventually, with WikiLeaks courting leaks, Hammond put the more public peanut butter hack and the chocolate leak together. Notably, neither ClimateGate or Hammond hack spawned immediate copycats, as Anonymous developed their hack and leak tactics independently. Interestingly enough, I'm looking at the German case, and some hackers involved with the Chaos Computer Club also did some hacking against Nazis and leaked it to the press around the same time. I'm trying to get that history in order. So basically, now this is 2010. This was 2009. This was Collateral Murder, released by WikiLeaks and Cablegate. And the point here is that hackers and hacktivists became part of the geopolitical landscape, right? They were always important politically, but this was like a new level. So basically, there was all this attention put on them. And now I'm going to get to how Anonymous got to the hack and leak independently and how Hammond got involved. So this is 2010. WikiLeaks is doing this thing. A group that had been part of Chinology, protesting Church of Scientology, broke away. They broke away because Chinology stopped using illegal methods like DDoS attacks. I don't have to explain a DDoS attack here, do I? Good. Right? So they broke away. They wanted to DDoS intellectual property organizations in the name of supporting piracy, partly because one organization actually DDoSed the Pirate Bay, and they're like, oh, if they can do it, we can do it. Again, this history is covered in my book. So one of the things they did was that they DDoSed a British law firm, ACS Law. And they targeted them because ACS Law had been threatening citizens with piracy lawsuits, often using pretty dubious methods. So they DDoSed the heck out of this website. And then the IT people, I guess they weren't very good. They restored the website, but there was a misconfiguration of the email server, and boom, all the emails were there for the taking. So they took them and put them on the Pirate Bay. And so what happened next? Reporters, Nate Anderson from Ars Technica, which is a very respected tech outlet in the United States, he really waded deeply through the emails, did that sort of like annoying, research, and ended up writing a very long story. I don't know why there's a mantis there. I haven't figured that one out. But basically, he analyzed the material, revealing how the firm recklessly accused people of piracy and downloading pornography. The exposure led to government fines against ACS Law for poor security and ultimately forced the firm to shut down. So this is when you sort of like, people Anonymous are like, oh, we can do this. The idea had been kind of planted. And so, fast forward a few months later, Anonymous got involved in the Arab Spring. And they actually tried to, well, they did. They hacked the Tunisian prime minister and got the emails, but felt they didn't find anything worthwhile. So they resorted to website defacements and DDoS attacks. And then something very, very consequential happened soon after that. And it has to do with the H.B. Gary affair. So Aaron Barr worked for H.B. Gary, a security company, and he had claimed to the Financial Times that he had infiltrated Anonymous and found the real names of the hackers and was going to go to the FBI to reveal them. And this story was published in the Financial Times. As it turns out, his names were actually wrong. But as a kind of, I guess, measure of defense and revenge, Anonymous in one evening hacked into H.B. Gary. They basically took all his emails, or the company's emails, wiped everything. So it was an act of sabotage. They even wiped his iPhone and iPad. And, you know, they were sort of, subsequent to that, there was just an amazing amount of news coverage about this event. So has anyone heard of this? Okay. Wow, history is very compact these days. So what was interesting too is they really, really did this purely for revenge. But they took the emails, they put them, on the Pirate Bay, WikiLeaks, and they were full of kind of fascinating information, including there was a plan to thwart and destroy WikiLeaks and its associates using dubious and illegal methods, such as implanting false information on WikiLeaks, trying to discredit any journalists that were supporting them. But this is really the central point. Because the hacked email content and logistics of the hack were juicy, shocking, and to some degree newsworthy, the H.B. Gary hack and leak dominated the news cycle at the time and became legendary among hackers. It was even featured on the Colbert Report for 15 minutes. So it received that kind of boost. So disgraced, Barr was forced to resign, and not long after H.B. Gary Federal closed down. In the euphoria of the victory, these hackers were emboldened to hack, and they did. And in fact, they went on a 50-day, so there was a group that had done this. They disbanded partly from Anonymous because Anonymous had actually, whatever you might think of them, they were politically motivated at the time, and LulzSec disbanded partly to hack companies to show how terrible their security was. And they were sort of looking to hack and leak a little bit, but they weren't that focused on it. They were just like, oh, your security sucks, and it again dominated the news because they did almost a hack a day. So what happened next was consequential. LulzSec had a sort of merry prankster vibe to it, and they disbanded partly due to all the intense hacking and infighting. And this was the moment that Jeremy Hammond, remember him, was sitting on the sidelines, and he's like, you know what? I used to hack by myself. There's this global movement. I can't help myself, so I'm going to join. It's probably not the best idea. He was on probation for another hack sabotage. So already, the law enforcement was kind of tracking him. But what did he do? So he joined right as LulzSec is disbanding, and reconstitute the group as anti-sec, and has a much, much more militant vibe, as you can see. And basically, the point of this kind of offshoot was to hack and leak, right? And so they hacked police organizations, security firms, they hacked companies like Stratfor, released the emails. I mean, this was their MO. And so really, at this point, you have the hack and leak as a tactic that absolutely exists. It's constituted, right? And it's probably not going away. But maybe it is going away, because you know what? Their security actually, Hammond's and other people in LulzSec was not so good, and many, many people were put to hacking pasture and got arrested in 2012. And what's interesting about this history is that at that point, that the tactic maybe could have taken off, not, it was a little bit unclear. And in fact, there really weren't many hacks and leaks between 2012 until 2014. And then all of a sudden, you really have a lot of hacks and leaks. So basically, for example, an offshoot group in Peru going by the name of Anonymous Peru or Anonymous Lulsec, they basically hacked into the government, and the government actually nearly dissolved after Lulsec Peru distributed hacked emails from the Department of the Interior corresponding teeming with corruption. So at this point, you know, with the exception of ClimateGate, and we don't know who they were, you know, this tactic tended to be used by hacktivists. And then in 2014, does anyone remember the first nation state hack and leak? It relates to a movie.
The interview.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Guardians of Peace, hack, sabotage, Sony. You know, obviously nation states were hacking, but they weren't leaking in this way. And I have no way to prove this because I don't have direct access to Guardians of Peace. If you do, please have them contact me. I can't help but think that the zeitgeist of the hack and leak helped motivate this tactic where, again, they were being like, we don't want this movie shown, so we're gonna, like, there was a warning, they hacked, they leaked, they sabotage, right? That same year, too, you had another entity going by the name of Phineas Fisher, who basically said that Hammond and Antisec was their hacking muse. And they're like, I'm going to start hacking and leaking. And they hit a couple of firms like Gamma Group that I think was based in the UK, hacking team in Italy. The hacks and leaks were covered pretty extensively by journalists. Hacking team for a period lost the right to export their license because they were selling like 0 days to dictatorial regimes and so on and so forth, right? The interesting thing about Phineas Fisher, who has been interviewed by Vice, they only agreed to an interview if they were represented as a cute dinosaur frog, which I think was very deliberate to kind of push against the idea of a shadowy kind of hacker or whatever. They've never been caught, partly I think because they learned from the mistakes of Anonymous, and so they're still out there at large. They don't appear very often as well. So one of their hacks happened in 2016. That was also the same year that Guccifer 2.0 hacked the Democratic National Convention, and basically, you know, first had the emails, no one was paying attention, and then kind of gave it to WikiLeaks. So one of the interesting things about this event, which allows me, I think, to connect the hack and leak to hacktivists, is Guccifer 2.0 tried to present themselves as a hacktivist. They're like, I'm a hacktivist. And that's like literally what they said. But no one believed them. Why is that? For those that maybe followed it and know, you know about hacker culture, I could just see. Why was it, you know, there was forensic evidence, obviously, but there was other reasons that made it so absolutely clear that they did not come from the hacktivist community and were, you know, in this case, a nation state.
Was it not discussed about in the hacker community? Was it kind of not?
I mean, it wasn't. It wasn't. What if we compare that to this? Like, they had no style, you know? It was just like, really? It was like boring. It was really clear that they didn't come from the communities that were doing this hack and leak. This is an important point that I'm going to get to later. But at the time, it was sort of like, we're going to pretend we're hacktivists, and everyone's like, come on, like, do a better job, right? But again, like I said, this is important. All right. That was a super brief genealogy with some of the kind of points. I mean, this is probably not as interesting to you, but I'm fascinated by the fact that it was not obvious to hackers, and that it took just the sort of right conditions to bring this tactic into being. You know, at this point, this tactic seems here to stay, unless we can fully secure our kind of servers, which, as we see right there, time is what determines security. Everything is kind of hackable. And it is the case that, while WikiLeaks isn't as visible or prominent, there's other groups like Distributed Denial of Secrets, which hosts all sorts of leaks, some from hacks and leaks, some from other sources, some they make public, some they don't make public. They'll also use leaks from ransomware groups as well, if they feel like it's in the public interest. And there's other kind of journalistic enterprises that now have kind of created software to help them mine this material. This is an example of a piece of software by a group that investigates organized crime. As you can see, they have like the HB Gary leaked emails, and it's a very sophisticated piece of software that allows them to mine through this material. Okay, so with that whirlwind in place, I have a question for the audience. Does the provenance, which I just explained, and genres of the hack and leak matter? By provenance, I mean, like, does it matter that we know how it came into being? Does that matter? I mean, from an academic perspective where we try to get things right, I think it does. I do think there's some implications that are broader than that. And so I am actually asking. And if you can't quite think about it now, maybe this is something we can talk about during the Q&A. And then the genres of the hack and leak. This, I mean, basically, does it matter whether it comes from a hacktivist, a nation state, ransomware group, right? So I do think it matters in terms of trying to identify when things happen or the source. We are in a massive crisis of disinformation and misinformation. And along with that, it's probably more pronounced in the United States, there is a huge crisis of credibility among journalists and other experts. I just think we need to get things right when we can, because basically when we don't, there are groups of people who will use that in order to discredit a group. And that's actually an explicit tactic used by quarters of the anonymous reactionary right, which I've also written about. And I mention this because actually a journalist who I really respect, nevertheless, for example, claimed in a book that Phineas Fisher was a Russian operative when there's really no evidence of that. And I think, if you're going to make those claims, you really got to, cross your T's and dot your I's. So part of my own interest in raising and understanding this history is to contribute to that project. The other kind of point I want to make is this one. So remember I said Gustafer 2.0 wasn't very good at making it seem like he was a hacktivist? I think that will change, right? I mean, just like Phineas now has very good security and anti-sec didn't, nation states will adapt as well. And the fog of hacking is a term I've used to kind of describe what will happen. So it will become harder, I think, in some instances, to trace the source. And then just as a final point, and then we can kind of move to the discussion, is it's been very, very interesting to track how journalists themselves are dealing with this problem of whether you report on this material, how you do it responsibly. And I just wanted to point you to some resources just in case you're interested. Stanford has released this kind of white paper, how to report responsibly on hacks and disinformation. And I've highlighted this quote, which says, reporters are a targeted adversary of foreign and domestic actors who want to harm our democracy. And to cope with this threat, especially in an election year, news organizations need to prepare for another wave of false, misleading, and hacked information. Often the information will be newsworthy. Expecting reporters to refrain from covering news goes against core principles of American journalism and the practical business drivers that shape the intensely competitive media marketplace, which is a very good point, right? There's incentives, economic incentives to do this. In these cases, the question is not whether to report, but how to do so most responsibly. Our goal is to give journalists actionable guidance. And again, they have many, many points, and I encourage folks to look through that. So that's all I'm going to say for now, because I'd love to make this a debate, possibly. I heard I'm going to be grilled, and then open it up for questions and comments. So thank you very much.
Thank you.